Hello. So in this series of videos, I'm going to be doing very brief overviews of different historical modes of reading or schools of literary and cultural theory. I'm going to try and cover a lot of them. Most of them will be 20th and 21st century because this is when we really had a proliferation of schools of critical thought. But in these very brief summaries, I'm going to try and give you a sense of the key ideas, key concerns, key innovations, and maybe some major drawbacks of these different schools. You'll also see that some of these schools have similar sets of concerns, and there's a lot of overlap between different approaches to literary and cultural theory, different approaches to how we read. So it's been a while since I've filmed a critical schools of literary and critical studies video, but we're back, baby! Yeah, we've got a few more schools that I want to cover. And the one we're going to be talking about in this video is critical race studies. So this is not exactly the same thing as critical race theory, which raised a whole bunch of kerfuffle here in the US recently, but it's also not exactly different. So critical race theory, so part of the thing is there's critical race theory, which is in fact a specific thing within legal scholarship. It has a very particular scope. Then there's critical race studies, which is a broader scale set of disciplines that applies not just in legal studies, but in all different kinds of literary and cultural studies as well. What people were largely upset about was not critical race theory necessarily, it was critical race studies. The idea that race and racism are significant elements in determining how a particular society functions. That is, race and racism structure systems of power, structure access to power, structure access to resources, structure cultural norms, etc., etc. And most societies have some form of racism. In the US, our primary racial history deals with the experiences of African Americans. But also another really significant one is the experiences of indigenous peoples, Native Americans. And I'm actually going to be doing a separate video on indigenous studies, which is a sub-discipline of critical race studies. But basically that is sort of the core focus of critical race studies, is what is the role of race and racism in structuring how a particular society functions. And again, what forms of racism, what groups are empowered or disempowered will vary from society to society. So in the US, again, it is we primarily think of this in terms of African American experiences. For instance, New Zealand, critical race studies would primarily focus probably on the experience of the Maori, though that's also related to indigenous studies. So there's that element. In Latin America, in many Latin American countries, you're going to have a much more dynamic relationship because you will often have significant African populations, particularly in a country like Brazil, or if we look at the Caribbean, a lot of countries, Barbados, Jamaica, Haiti, etc., will have significant African diasporic populations. But you've also got the Spanish, you've got indigenous peoples, you've got often the French, the Dutch, all of these different groups who sort of historically have coexisted or colonized or been enslaved or whatever it is in particular countries. So the racial dynamics can be very, very complicated. And again, the focus in the US on African American experiences primarily tends to oversimplify the racial dynamics of the US. There are also scholars who work extensively on the Asian American experience, East Asian or South Asian. People who work extensively on Hispanic or Chicano experiences, indigenous studies, again. And all of these things are further complicated when you throw things like feminism in there, or you throw things like Marxism in there. How does social class interact with racial power and lack thereof? How does gender impact this, etc., etc.? But basically, some of the key questions that critical race studies focus on are things like how are systems of power constructed? So this is a significant one, and this would be the one that critical race theory is within, that very specific legal focus on how the justice system is set up to particularly privilege some racial or ethnic groups while penalizing disproportionately other racial or ethnic groups. But also things like how is housing valued in different neighborhoods? How are resources allotted to different neighborhoods? Because those have a racial basis, and there's a long history that goes into that. One of my students right now actually is doing a project at time of filming. He probably won't be my student anymore by the time this video goes up, but one of my students is doing a project on the vast disproportion of African-American NFL players versus African-American coaches or owners of NFL teams. So all of these kinds of things are tied to these questions of how is power structured based around racial or ethnic hierarchies, relative levels of power, etc., or relative levels of privilege, etc., etc. Another component of critical race studies is what is the experience of being a racial or ethnic minority within a society. And this, of course, can vary significantly depending on a number of particular factors. But you think about, so some of the big components of this, for instance, you think about W.E.B. Du Bois, the idea of double consciousness, that sense that Du Bois theorized in the early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s, that African Americans are essentially divided psychologically between being Americans, but also not feeling like they are Americans. So this is sort of the bind, the self-identification, but also the division from the self. So the African-American subject, according to Du Bois, is an American and identifies as an American, but also there is the marker of difference. Being African-American is a marker of difference, not fully being American in some way. So there's that self-division. Also, the theorist Frantz Fanon, in his book Black Skin, White Masks, talks about this same phenomenon, being from the Caribbean, being a French citizen, French speaker, full French citizen, but when he goes to Paris, he is aware for the first time of how un-French he is, because he is Caribbean, and because, more importantly, because he is Black. So this experience of the sort of divided self and this feeling of not quite fitting into the society in which you fit, is in which you are born, is a significant constitutive element of the racial or ethnic minority experience. And it's worth pointing out, not for nothing, that this is a fundamental component of the Jewish experience as well, historically. We are a diasporic people, and much of the justification for anti-Semitism, if not the actual root of it, has been a sense that the Jew is always going to have divided loyalty. This was the big thing with the Dreyfus affair in France in the 19th century, right? This idea that, like, well, Dreyfus is French, he's an army officer, there's no question about him being French, but because he's Jewish, he's also tied to an international people. And so Dreyfus was found guilty when he definitely wasn't, etc., etc. So this sort of, this sense of belonging but not fully belonging tends to characterize minority groups' experiences. So that's one element of it. That, how does that constitute you psychologically? Another component of this is simply the question of that power imbalance again. Like, if you are an African American, this is actually a pretty good example, I think, because in the past 10 years or so, police institutional violence against African Americans has become an internationally recognized issue. If you are an African American and you are aware that any interaction with police, the symbol of the state, symbol of authority, of law and order, that can be fatal, whether that use of lethal force is justified or not, and it's unlikely that police officer will face any consequences, that shapes the way that you will behave in public spaces. If you are white or look white, you tend to have a much greater feeling of security, probably, with police officers. Whereas if you are African American, you're much more likely to be conscious of the threat that they pose to you, the potential that they have to kill you with no repercussions, for instance. So these questions of power dynamics and how power dynamics shape one's experience of the world, this is deeply, deeply reflected in literature by African Americans, Jewish American literature, the literature of other minority groups in different contexts. But then the other big component, I would say, of critical race studies is liberatory ideology. And what I mean by that is basically the attempt to figure out the most effective way of responding to and undercutting these systems of power, these systems of alienation, etc., etc. So how do African Americans, for instance, combat systemic racism? What were the strategies of the civil rights movement? What were the strategies of the sort of militarized wing of the civil rights movement, groups like the Black Panthers, etc., etc.? What are the strategies of Black Lives Matter? What are the legal strategies that are used, etc., etc.? So this more sort of goal-oriented approach, how do we ensure our rights are respected, and how do we make sure that the rights and protections that we are getting are actually going to solve the problems of racism, or move toward solving the problems of racism more realistically. So this sort of question of implementation is another big component of critical race studies.